Hello, everybody. This is week number 2, the beginning of week number 2. I'm not sure if I'm going to give a really long lecture and then cut it in half and make it 2 lectures, or if I'll do 2 independent lectures. Let's see. This week, we're focusing on Marshall McLuhan, on the text that I will upload before around the time I upload this video for you, namely Understanding Media. I believe the subtitle is The Extensions of Man. So what I'd like to do today is to try to give you a primer, a sort of introductory, fairly comprehensive overview of Marshall McLuhan's work, his basic project, his major concepts, and theories. And after that, in another class, we'll see what we can do with those concepts. We can see how we can put them to use. And I might tie a few threads into some of the stuff that I talked about last week. So try and be attentive to the way I use some of the language so that you can see how it resonates with maybe some of the stuff from Freud or from Simmel or Nietzsche. Okay, so I have this text that will be posted online, Understanding Media. And what I'd like you to do is, although I'm probably going to post the whole book, I'm not sure yet, I just want you to read maybe 1 or 2 chapters, 3 at the most. And when I say read, again, I mean just quickly skim. And I think that should be good for both lectures for this week. Otherwise, I may add 1 more short text. I'm not sure yet, but it's not exactly a text. It's more like gosh, it's almost like a comic book. You know, like 1 page will take you 2 seconds to read. There's like a brief bit of text and then an image. It's meant to be provocative or evocative. So I may post 2, but you know, at least have a look at Understanding Media, although it is written in a less engaging style. You know, it's weird because when you read Understanding Media, you're not going to get you'll get a little bit of a sense of Marshall McLuhan's style, which is very unusual. It's a very unusual style, but there's a reason why he deploys that style. And hopefully by the end of the lecture, the week, you'll understand what I mean by Marshall McLuhan's style. He writes in a way that makes his content reflexive of the form of the media, the form of the engagement, particularly the dominant media of the time, electronic media at the time of Marshall McLuhan when he published this. So I think what I'll do is I'll begin maybe with a few biographical remarks. I'm not sure how much I can say in terms of biography for Marshall McLuhan, but I'll say a little bit. You know, I recently ordered, do I have it beside me? I'm going to pause for 1 moment. So I recently ordered a very rare print of a book by Marshall McLuhan and his son, Eric McLuhan. And some of these things will come in handy later today. It's called City as Classroom. I can't put this online. You probably will not find a version of it online. It's been out of print for a very long time. I paid a lot of money for it using my research fund at Nipissing University, which is the only reason I was able, because I wouldn't have paid it out of my own pocket. But it's a very interesting book because so it's called City as Classroom. I don't know if you can see it. Understanding Language and Media. You can see that language is very important for Marshall McLuhan, and hopefully you'll notice the way he plays with language, as some of you are maybe slowly realizing I do as well in my talks. Some of you probably pass by it and don't even notice that I'm using words that mean multiple things and stuff. But when you hear it, hopefully it affects you a little bit and it resonates. This was part of Marshall McLuhan's technique. He called it a probe. Maybe I'll bring up a whiteboard. Here we go. Probe or probing. Probes are different than, he considers it a pedagogical device, a device meant to offer insight. Probes are different than typical academic styles of learning, because in a typical academic style of learning, let's say a traditional academic style of learning, you get a concept and then you get a definition. And it's all very clear. It's like you have a dictionary or an encyclopedia. And when you're studying, you can very easily say, okay, this word or this concept or this theory equals this. And you can kind of memorize it, right? A probe is aimed in the electronic age, which we're going to learn more about today. A probe is designed precisely to do the opposite, not to close down meanings and to give you answers, but precisely to open up meanings. In other words, to confuse you a little bit. And for good reason, because it means that you will think, and you will think more particularly about the environment within which we live. So it's that sort of style. That's one ingredient in Marshall McLuhan's style, but it's that sort of style that you see in this book, for example, City as Classroom, which is a book about the changing role of the university and the college. Canada, college means something slightly different than it does in the United States and other places, but let's say the university and the college, how it changes during the electronic age, the contemporary age, the last, I don't know, several decades or longer. It's an age when all the knowledge is at your fingertips at the speed of light, fiber optic. All the knowledge is already there in advance of you entering the university. In fact, what's the role of the university? Think about it. You have all the knowledge right there on your cell phones, on your laptops. You can find anything. There's Wikipedia pages on everything. Like if I said you're going to have a test on the Spanish Civil War, Google Spanish Civil War, you don't need me. You can find it. You could probably find a better answer than any professor out there. Very few professors would like to agree with me, but it's a fact. This is a fact. Knowledge exists already out there. It's presupposed outside of the university, which leads to a question of what the role of the university is. You might claim, among other things, that it's to give you the right questions, because you wouldn't know to Google the Spanish Civil War unless I brought it up. So it might be a place of asking questions rather than a place of providing answers. But the point is, it's changed. We used to go to the university to get knowledge. You went there because you didn't have knowledge outside of the university. Well, you had some knowledge, but not some systematic, rigorous sort of knowledge. The university was a place where there was a universe of knowledge. And you would go there and you would presume your professor to be capable of professing his knowledge to you, and you would accept it, and perhaps many of us still believe this, let's say naively. We question it, though, at the same time. We think we believe it, but do we really believe it? I mean, after all, if you really believed it, you wouldn't be involved in rating your professor's performance. You would presume that he's competent and he knows everything, he or she or they know everything, right? So we're in an age where you rate your professor, and your doctors and your judges, both on the internet and using various metrics that the university provides you as well. And this has a real impact on the career of your professor, believe it or not. So, and maybe even some of the people who run these institutions still believe that to some extent. I'm not convinced that they really do, but they'll pretend often that they believe it. But it doesn't make it true simply because you believe it. It could be a function of the university. That's an indefinite article, not a definite article. Not the function, but a function, one of the possible functions of the university, but not the central or exclusive function of the university anymore. This is part of Marshall McLuhan's claim. So if you wonder why there's some playfulness, some abstraction, a lot of talking, sometimes quite spontaneously here, instead of these strict slides where the knowledge, I bring the knowledge to you prepared in advance and you simply consume it. This is a part of the reason we're justified in our approach, according to McLuhan, right? McLuhan was born in Edmonton. I said I'd do a biography, so I'll do it. He was born in Edmonton, Alberta, which makes him Canadian. He earned 2 degrees in that area of Canada in English literature, if I remember correctly, which explains why he quotes Shakespeare so much. I think he did a degree in Manitoba before going to Cambridge University. For most of this earliest period of his life, he was raised Christian, a Baptist. His parents were Baptist, but he found himself for quite a while quite unsatisfied by religion. He sought through his own self-confession. I think I've read this in his autobiography, which I have beside me here. This was put together by the McLuhan Institute in Alberta. Marshall McLuhan's grandson, I think, made this autobiography and gave me a copy. It's very short. It's just a few pages, and it doesn't read like a biography. But I'm culling some of this from this document here. But I suppose what he really was interested in is truth and beauty, and he found that in literature rather than in religion. We might want to claim that it's not all that different, and we might even have a point. I mean, Nietzsche, for example, claimed that, I'm quoting him from memory, I might have one or two words wrong, but so long as we still have grammar, we have not yet killed God. In the beginning was the Word. This is part of one religious tradition anyway, to claim that. And there's something here that Nietzsche's saying about the way language functions, as if there's a certain type of belief there. McLuhan liked to, I feel myself rambling a little bit, but trust me, I'm going to get to some structure in a moment. McLuhan reminded us that when we read literature, when we read anything, reading, the word read is etymologically linked to the word guessing. We're making guesses. It's a faith that we understand what a person means when they write something to us. It's a faith. It's a belief system in that sense. In any case, this digression is not all that fruitful, so I'll continue. At Cambridge, McLuhan got in touch with the work, the writings of G.K. Chesterton. Oh, the T on my keyboard doesn't work. I busted the T on my keyboard today. I forgot. I ordered a new keyboard, so that'll be fixed. This is supposed to be a cheat. Chesterton. Oh, I apologize. T here and a T here. Now it looks very Christian because Chesterton was a Christian, which is why McLuhan suddenly became interested in Christianity, in Catholicism. Indeed, it was because of G.K. Chesterton that Marshall McLuhan converted to Catholicism. And it's just fascinating because you can see, if you watch some talks, and I encourage you to watch Marshall McLuhan speak, Google his name on YouTube, and you're gonna hear him come up with don't watch his lectures, watch his interviews. It'll just blow your mind how witty he is. It's entertaining. It's honestly entertaining. But he would give these interviews, and you would see sometimes in these YouTube videos at the front, a priest or two, some nuns, and they'll ask him questions. The Jesuits in particular were very interested in Chesterton's work. I quote McLuhan, I'm quoting him, "Had I not encountered G.K. Chesterton's work, I would not have remained agnostic for many years at least. Chesterton did not convince me of religious faith, but he prevented my despair from becoming a habit or hardening into misanthropy." Well, I don't know if he was necessarily not that he was not misanthropic. By around 1937, McLuhan converted to Catholicism then. And it's interesting. For a number of reasons, maybe we can return to it later. I'm just kind of planting seeds. Over the next few years after mid-1930s, he took on modest jobs teaching at small universities and colleges, mostly in the United States and Canada, if I recall. Eventually in the 1940s, he found a way to the University of Toronto, which became really his home. When I was growing up, there was a CBC sort of Know Your Canadian Heritage commercial, and you can find it on YouTube. I can't play it because copyright will screw up the upload of my video to YouTube. But it shows McLuhan lecturing to students at the University of Toronto when he suddenly comes upon his key expression, which we'll discuss soon enough. The medium is the message. It was there that he met Harold Innes, a very important colleague to Marshall McLuhan. Thank God there's no T in that word. Harold Innes's work was very important to Marshall McLuhan, and I would say even foundational. You can see a lot of Harold Innes's ideas in Marshall McLuhan's work later. And to this day, there's still buildings at the University of Toronto named after Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innes, among others. I studied psychoanalysis in the Harold Innes building just beside the library, Robarts, I think the library is called. In the 1950s, Marshall McLuhan received funding from the Ford Corporation. And this launched to deliver a lecture series. And this launched him into sudden popularity, which was national, and then it was international popularity. Suddenly he was giving lectures and interviews to everybody all over the place. He was all over Canadian media, radio and television in particular. He even had a role in some films, particularly a popular film by Woody Allen. Woody Allen, of course, defended Marshall McLuhan when they tried to remove his name from the University of Toronto buildings. Woody Allen had in his film Annie, was it Annie or Annie Hall, I think? Marshall McLuhan had a short guest appearance. And you can find that on YouTube as well. Okay, so at this time, McLuhan began to work on a popular journal titled Explorations with Edmund Carpenter. And here is where we finally begin to see emerge what's called today the Toronto School. In sociology, we talk about the Chicago School. We hardly ever talk about the Toronto School, and yet we should. We really should. That's a moral imperative. It's a rule. We must talk about the Toronto School because it's a remarkable thing that we had in Canada. Revolutionary. The Toronto School, they call it the Toronto School of Cultural Studies, the Toronto School of Communication Theory, of Media Theory, of Media Ecology, whatever. It goes by many names. We call it the Toronto School. Today, we'd include Marshall McLuhan into the Toronto School, Harold Innes, Edmund Carpenter, Eric Havelock, Havelock, and Northrop Frye. I should spell that in case any of you care about these names. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but especially this last one because he's I don't have a T. Forgive me. There's a T here. Okay. Oh, that looks ominous. Okay. Good. So they established together, I think in 1963, yes, 1963, at the University of Toronto, especially for Marshall McLuhan, the Center for Culture and Technology, which today goes by a different name. I believe it's the McLuhan Program in Culture and Technology is what it's called today. In the late 1960s, I mentioned he rose to international fame, but he was also diagnosed with a brain tumor, which obviously affected him because not long after, in the 1970s, first he received the Order of Canada, one of the most, if not the most prestigious prize you can get in Canada. You get that little lapel pin, the flower. But he ended up having a stroke in 1979. His language being, I mentioned language earlier, his language being severely disturbed. He couldn't speak except he would endlessly repeat, if I remember from a biography written by Douglas Coupland, the Canadian artist, C-O-U-P, quite the coup, C-O-U-P-L-A-N-D, Douglas Coupland. In his biography of Marshall McLuhan, he said that McLuhan would repeat the expression, "Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy," 3 times. He'd look off into a window at butterflies and so on. He'd just repeat, "Oh boy, oh boy," but he wouldn't say much else. It's all he could say. You'll note the repetition of his language. McLuhan was an expert in pattern recognition, recognizing repetitions of patterns, and he remarked upon this often in his work. Okay, one final biographical detail, of course, Marshall McLuhan had 6 children, one of which was Eric McLuhan, who did a lot of work with him. You can see McLuhan and McLuhan at the top. One of those McLuhans is Marshall, the other is Eric. And Eric McLuhan had a son named Andrew McLuhan, who now runs the McLuhan Institute and lectures on the legacy of Marshall McLuhan and media theory. And he is the one we will have as a guest lecture soon. Again, I can't say what an honor it is. Marshall McLuhan died on December the 31st, 1980, at the turn of the decade. Some of his major works include, now it's gonna, you know what? I'm gonna copy and paste a T. Okay, so I now have a T that I can copy and paste. So The Mechanical Bride, that was published in 1951. Maybe I'll just say a word or two about each of these publications for now. The Mechanical Bride, just a word or two. And these, I'm just talking about his major works. There's many others here that I'm not mentioning. The Mechanical Bride was, I think it's his first really important work, I would claim. And it explored popular culture. It explored popular culture, particularly like things we would consider to be media, such as newspapers, comic books, particularly advertisements within newspapers and so on. And McLuhan notices that the power of the culture industry, I'm using this word for a particular reason, because it's a key word used in Marxist theory, which we will get to in another class. So, you know, we will get to this in another class, but by Adorno and Horkheimer. They make a similar claim as what Marshall McLuhan was making here in 1951. And McLuhan's noticing that the culture industry, it's an industry that makes money off of culture, for culture and technology, popular culture. And McLuhan's noticing that, you know, at around this time, it's the first time in history when, you know, mostly because of capitalism and its convergence with technology and science, there's an educated and paid army of workers whose job is precisely to influence people at the level of culture, to use culture to make money and to influence people. And so what they're doing is they're deploying, according to Marshall McLuhan, I'm watering it down quite a bit, but they're deploying psychological tricks and insights in order to influence people, basically. That's advertising, in order to get them to watch their ads and pay attention, to get them to dedicate time to their own immersion in propaganda, you might say. I'm quoting Marshall McLuhan here. Quote, "Ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained individual minds have made it a full-time business to get inside the collective public mind," end quote. So I don't think we see McLuhan here at his best, but he's certainly at his most critical. Closest to the Marxist tradition here of critiquing popular culture and kind of critiquing it as something like what you might call naively ideology. But he is offering, nonetheless, some profound insights, I think, many of which we now take for granted. For example, he claimed that because we're constantly today, in the electronic age, constantly stimulated, key concept from last week, stimulated by advertisements, by electronic media, we're constantly stimulated, it makes us somewhat helpless. We become helpless. That's what George Simmel was claiming in his own way, using his own concepts, his own words. He was saying the same thing. It renders us numb. Those are the words of Marshall McLuhan too, numb. It makes us numb, makes us helpless. We're stimulated constantly in the electronic age. But McLuhan goes even a little bit further, and he assesses this more critically than Simmel did. Why is it that they want to get inside our minds? The culture industry. To influence us, yes, but McLuhan put it more critically. He says to manipulate us. I'm quoting him, to manipulate, exploit, and control us, end quote. Well, this attitude of Marshall McLuhan, this old attitude of, that we used to see in the 1950s, of form of Marxism, where there's some sort of people out there trying to manipulate us and influence us and control us and exploit us and so on. This didn't last long in Marshall McLuhan's lifelong work, but it was there in the early 1950s in this particular work. Ultimately, what McLuhan wants us to recognize is the effect of the culture industry, which is an industry that makes use of stimulations and technology. It affects us. It affects us at the level of our affect by stimulating us. So he wants us to observe the way in which the media, in its very form, not in terms of what the media is telling us, what newspapers are telling us, but in the very fact of there being electronic media, it affects our social behaviors. It affects our minds. We're going to get more into this more deeply in a moment. The second book that I want to just quickly mention before digging deeper is The Gutenberg Galaxy. Okay, so the Gutenberg Galaxy, and that was published in 1962, 11 years later. In this book, McLuhan's picking up on a number of themes that he has developed in both The Mechanical Bride and in other works leading up to the Gutenberg Galaxy. He's looking at the effects of mass media. How does mass media affect our social behaviors, our consciousness, our perceptions, our minds? Ultimately, he's looking at the cultural effects of mass media. He focuses more particularly on the printing press. And the printing press, of course, being a key form of media that will repetitively produce copies of the same book. There may only be one or two of these right now, but these other books I have back here, you can find many, 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 many copies of them. Like this one, for example, I ordered not long ago, and it said, it'll take an extra week because they have to print it. It was print on demand. They print they don't print any in advance. And, so the printing press is what he's looking at. And he wants to say, what does the printing press do to our social relationships? What does the printing press do to our perception of the world, of other people? What does it do to culture, to consciousness, to civilization? And he says, what is the effect? He discusses the development of society into what he calls the global village. And the printing press has something to do with pushing us into the global village. Again, I'm just giving you a quick overview of this book. I'm going to get into more of the details very soon when I get into key concepts, global village being one of them. But his basic point is that the printing press produced a different type of world that led us into what he calls the global village, basically a world where we're all connected to one another, but we all feel like we're living in our own little villages nonetheless. They're connected villages, tribal society. Think of Facebook. You feel so connected on Facebook, yeah? But you feel so lonely nonetheless, but you keep going, lonely, I'm connected. No, I'm lonely, this sort of thing. It reminds me of this joke by a comedian whose name I'm not going to mention because it's very controversial now, but he talks about, in an interview, he talks about how you pick up the phone to relieve the trauma of feeling alone, then you put it down. If you don't pick it up again, you just explode and you're crying in sadness. Oh, I could identify. I mean, I used to be able to identify with that until I went through psychoanalysis. But This is kind of what McLuhan's talking about when he says global village, okay? The printing press produced this fundamentally different type of human, a different type of social bond, way of relating to other people. And he calls this new type of human, not what Nietzsche called him, the overman, the Übermensch, not what Emma Goldman called the individual, although I think these are all kind of related in some way. None of those. He calls the new human, developed through the invention of the printing press, calls Gutenberg man. I'm going to put sick beside it. Sick just means that McLuhan calls this Gutenberg man, but it could be woman, could be, any gender. And the point is Gutenberg human, but, his expression was man. So that's why I put sick, just to point that out. So we're not going to get fully into the specifics of these arguments just yet. I'm just giving you a quick overview of some of these books, okay? The next book, sequentially, is the one that I've posted online, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. This was in 1964. So I'm not going to talk about this right now because a lot of the material from the rest of the lecture today, or the second lecture for this week, will deal with this more particularly, and that also goes for the medium is the message. Now, some of you are laughing because I wrote message wrong. I put massage, but that's how it was titled on the book, and there's a particular reason for that. It's because McLuhan said the medium as the environment. We're going to get more into this. Don't worry, I'm just giving you a sneak peek. The medium as the environment massages us and our social relationships, makes us feel comfortable in that environment and take it for granted, even though we're determined by it and it hurts us and so on. Okay. So let me just close this now. So I think where I'm going to start with his conceptual vocabulary is beginning with a notion of figure and ground. Figure and ground. It's this conceptual pair McLuhan extracted, particularly in his later work. He extracted it from within psychology. It was in psychology. People were using this conceptual pair of figure and ground in order to describe the way in which we perceive the world. So it's to describe perceptual frameworks. It concerns our perceptions, our perceptual frameworks. And the ground is a synonym. Ground is a synonym for, let's say, something like context or environment. When we're talking about the ground, we're talking about the context within which we perceive something, or the environment within which we perceive something, or within which we form social bonds or something like that. So it's through the figure that we can get a sense of the context of the environment, in other words, of the ground. So I'll put the arrow like this. We can't see the ground for what it is directly. We can only see it through the figure. And I know this sounds really abstract right now, but I'm going to try and slowly bring you to some sort of an understanding of it. What is a figure? Well, look, if I hold up an object, a book, here, I'm holding it up. I'm holding up this object, right? And you can see it. It's clearly delineated so that you can take it as one object, and that object is a book. That's the figure. Figure is always carefully delineated. It has contours and so on, and you can clearly see it for what it is. You perceive it. And in perceiving it as an object, you feel like you understand it. And at some sense, psychologically, you grasp that object. The figure is, it jumps out at you. If I hold this here, it jumps out at you, right? Like you can, that's Marshall McLuhan's expression. It jumps out at you. The figure always jumps out at you. So it's like an object. In some sense, you can imagine how it's related to Freud's concept of the ego. The ego is clearly defined. It's your sense, your imaginary sense of yourself. It jumps out at you. It's how you imagine yourself. I am a professor. Okay, it's foregrounded. Now I understand what I am. So you can mark where it begins, where it ends, what its edges are, and so on. Well, that's not the case for the environment. The environment is everything else within which you perceive this book. Maybe you think of it as my home here. You're in my home. The objects of my home are all in your screen, and you can see several objects. There's a painting above me, a lampshade over here, a pillow, you know. There's figures, there's clear figures. All those figures allow you to sense the environment that I'm placed in, right? Okay, let's take a more popular example, and I saw it earlier, so I think I'll use it. This is from the city as classroom. Oh, now I'm not going to be able to find it, I bet. It was a really good one. Oh, here it is. This object here. I don't know what it looks like to you. To me, I didn't read it, so I'm probably going to get it wrong, but to me, I see maybe a telephone. But when I'm looking at the telephone, I don't see the fact that it looks like there's two foxes or something here. Yeah. Another example here. This one's perhaps better. This is a very famous one. I can't remember what the name of it is, but you look at this and you can see, if you see an old woman, this is the figure. You see an old woman looking down, in which case this is her eye, this is her hair, this is like a shawl, this is her mouth, this is her nose here. You see a figure of the old woman. However, if you look at it a different way, and it takes me a while now, it looks like a young woman looking away. This is her ear, this is her jawline, her cheek, her nose over the edge here, you know, her neck here. But you can't see both of them at the same time, because the figure obscures, and this is a fundamental point for McLuhan, a figure obscures your view of the environment, even while it shows you something of the environment, right? So you saw from that example I just gave you, I'll give you one more, maybe a more concrete one. Some of you are probably familiar with this. I'm going to do it really bad, I'm sure. I'm sure some of you have seen this one before. Now, you could see two faces here, right? Like here and here, if I put eyes looking at each other. But if you're looking at that, what you're not seeing is maybe it's a candlestick. You know, like this is the candlestick. You put the candle up here. The point is, if you look at one figure, it obscures you from getting a total view. Right? So this is what figure ground allows us to imagine. When you see the figure, you're obscured from a total view of the environment, even though the figure is within the environment, right? That's the key point. What I've just said is the full definition of figure and ground. So when you look at it, you focus on an object. To do that, you must separate the object to some extent from the totality of its environment. So perhaps here you see two faces, perhaps you see a vase or a candlestick. It's very difficult, though not impossible, to see both at the same time. The vast majority of people will see one or the other at any given time. Some people can see both at the same time, and it says something about their psychology, which I can't get into right now, but I'd love to. In other words, that maybe the psychological function of repression is not working in the same way that it does for typical people who have a more firm type of repression. But, you know, you must focus. That's what any sane person would do. They would focus on one or the other. You can't see both. When you see both, you see the environment. So what is the environment in all of this? The environment is that zone of unattention, the thing you're not focusing on, the thing that's obscured by whatever it is that you're focusing on at a given moment. Another example, because I know this is really a difficult thought for some of you, is maybe, and I'm thinking spontaneously, as I often do, the magician. A magician will cause you to focus at one spot, maybe like will cause you to focus. Let me try something. Don't have a pen. So if I write something and I'm a magician and I say, look over here, look at this. Maybe you're not seeing over here what I was holding, which is do not look at this. That's how the magician's trick works. Really relies on focus, because that way you won't see the more environmental stuff that's going on to make the trick function, right? And it's always about an optical illusion in this sense. The electronic age is all about optics. So the environment is a zone of unattention that's out of focus. So we have a distinction. There's objects of perception, and then there's the environment, which is out of our attention, but gives rise to these objects. Okay. McLuhan wanted to study the media through this conceptual pair of figure and ground. Yes, we see particular forms of media. There's a microphone in front of me here, a big microphone. There's a laptop in front of me. You see your laptop in front of you, no doubt. When you see a newspaper or a book, you focus on the figure of the book. Like, look, there's some pages here. This is the figure of the book. I can read it. I know I'm saying things that seem quite obvious, but it's important because the obvious stuff is what we focus on. But we seldom understand the environment within which media objects as figures are perceived. This is his fundamental point. We focus only on the media objects for what they are, and not on the environment that the media itself is implicated in. So what we tend to do is we focus on the pages of the book and the book itself, or the newspaper itself, or the microphone, these various media objects, instead of trying to see the way in which there is an environment to the media that we are bracketing out, ignoring, that we're not paying attention to, that we're neglecting. So this brings me to my second topic, which is the medium is the message. This is his biggest expression that everybody seems to know from McLuhan. What does it mean? It means that what really ultimately matters when we study the media is the environment, the media as environment, not the media as figure. So think about the newspaper. You might say, okay, when I read the newspaper, one newspaper tells me the facts, the other newspaper is fake news. If you're focusing on the newspaper in this way, you're missing the point. If you prefer watching CNN to Fox News or Fox News to CNN, you're missing the point. If you prefer to hear only certain things on the telephone, you're missing the point of the telephone. You never focus on the content, according to McLuhan. It doesn't matter what is written in the newspaper. What matters is what newspaper itself as a form does to our social relationships. The newspaper is media in the sense that the newspaper is the environment, which sustains our social relationships in space and time. So it doesn't matter what's written in the newspaper. What matters is what newspaper does to our social relationships. So it doesn't matter what's on the television, whether it's CNN or Fox News. What matters is what television does to us and our social relationships. It doesn't matter what's on the telephone, what we hear on the telephone. What matters is what the telephone does to our social relationships. And we can go on through all media. So, for example, it doesn't matter what a person says to me on the telephone. If a person says, I hate you or I love you, or neither of those, I'm indifferent to you. None of that matters, according to McLuhan, when we study the media. What matters is what the telephone does to us, our social relationship, what effect it has upon us. Let me give you an example. When I was younger, my parents, it was a big event, you know, my parents needed to figure out where to install the telephone in the house, because you needed to install the telephone onto a wall. It was like furniture. You would chain it to a wall, and then when you talked on it, it would chain itself to you. It was like an umbilical cord in the sense that there was a cord attached to the phone. You know, so you couldn't walk anywhere like outside like you can today with one of these phones. The other thing was that because the telephone was chained to a wall and you were chained to it, you needed to know when it was important to talk on the telephone. So you needed to hear the ringtone. It wasn't called a tone then, the ringer. And the ringer would be so loud, you could hear it outside and at the neighbor's house, because you needed to run to the phone to pick it up. So what does the telephone do to our social relationships in space and time? Well, what the telephone does is it forces, at this time, this type of telephone, the rotary telephone, let's say, where you had to move, you know, you didn't have flat screen and buttons, you had to put your finger in a hole and go like this. This is the telephone I grew up with. You needed to go to it. That's what it did to us. So if you were playing in the backyard, you would hear the phone ring. You would have to run to the living room or wherever the phone was installed, shut off the television. Everybody would have to be quiet so that you can talk on the phone. Or let's say you're waiting for the doctor to call you to tell you about your test results. You would have to stay home from work to get the call and stay home at the phone. What did it do to us? It pulled us to the phone, and our social relationships would gravitate around the phone. Well, it's not like that with the cell phone. With the cell phone, clearly our social relationships are different in space and time because we don't need a ringer. Most people don't even use a ringer on their cell phone, you know, maybe vibrate, but half of us don't even do that probably. I don't know what the stats are on it. I'd have to check, but I presume it's quite high that most people don't use ringers or anything like that anymore. In other words, we'll get to the phone when we are damn well ready. So we don't have to go to the phone comes to us. Other people come to us. A text message on a phone is a message saying, you know, I won't interrupt you. You get to it when you're ready. There's no goodbye or hello in texting. There is on the phone. You have to signal that you're there. Hello. Hello means like you're shouting down the line to make sure somebody can hear you so you can get the signal. You're announcing your presence. Now the other has to announce their presence to us. So it's important to use this as a counterpoint because the television does something different to us than the phone, and the radio does something different to us than social media. What does the radio do to social relationships in space and time compared to, let's say, social media today? To give you another example, remember we're focusing on the media as environment, not so it doesn't matter what people say on the radio, right? What matters is what radio does to our social relationships in space and time. Well, the radio is very interesting because it presumes that there cannot be much silence, because if there's silence, you might think the radio's off. You can have silence on television because you'll still have a video, there'll still be images on the screen to signal that it hasn't been shut off. But the radio, you need to have sound. You know, there can't be many gaps. If the gap is too long, you'll think your radio's busted. So you must fill the dead air. Who fills the dead air? It's the person on the other end of the radio. So people go to their radio station with, you know, all their information already prepared in advance, and then they speak, And then it goes through the speaker to an audience that's passive. You cannot talk back to radio. So it presumes a unidirectional relationship between the person who has the information, who's at the other end of at the radio station, tends to be one privileged person or a couple privileged people who have the information. They deliver it unidirectionally. I suppose I'll draw this. So, there's the radio host, let's say, who has the information, delivers it in one direction out to a whole bunch of people who have the radios on. And so the audience is out here. These are all members of the audience. And they just passively receive the information. They can't talk back. So all the information is provided in advance, you passively receive it. Well, that's not how it works today on social media, right? Social media, it's actually quite the opposite. It's interesting, right? Let's say social media. Let's say, I don't know, Twitter, okay? Twitter or Facebook, whatever. Snapchat, I don't know what's cool anymore. You got all this TikTok crap. I don't know what's going on. I'm just kidding. I like TikTok. My son's on it. Okay, so you have Twitter, and Twitter doesn't provide you any information. It's not like a radio host. It doesn't provide you any information. It provides a platform precisely for what? For you to provide it with information. Right? So the audience provides the information, and of course it comes back to the audience. It's a bad drawing, but you get the point. It's not unidirectional. The information is not prepared in advance by the host. It's prepared by the audience, and it comes back at you. So I'm giving you a naive sort of conception of why it matters that the medium is the message. Media, being plural of medium, the media is the message, not its content, not what you're reading, not what's heard, not its content, but the media itself as environment structures our social relationships in space and time quite differently. Okay. So we have this notion of media as environment, but it gets a little bit deeper than this for McLuhan, and we're going to go off the deep end now. If at any point around this time you want to take a break, please pause the video, take a short break, come back to it, because it can get a little boring listening for a very long time, especially when it's not interactive like Twitter. It can feel a little bit like radio. It can feel a bit unidirectional and impressive, and the times are not structured for that right now. So that's why it's hard for you to pay attention when somebody's endlessly talking, because we're not living in the age of radio anymore, even though a lot of people practice politics and pedagogy teaching as if we were. The fact is we're not. So the next big idea from McLuhan that I want to discuss is his very loose definition of media. So what is media? Well, we've been talking about traditional media, like, newspapers, television, magazines, radio, etc. That's what, we've been focusing on media in that way, but for McLuhan, media is not just the traditional stuff that you imagine when you think of mass media. What's really fascinating about McLuhan is that he really hones in on this, the real, let's say, the etymology of the word media, which simply means to mediate. Media is what mediates between social relationships. And what mediates social relationships is our social structure, our social environment, right? Objects in our social environment. So he talks about media objects as, basically everything. Everything is a media object, not just newspapers, but also, I don't know, this bottle of vitamin water, a pen. Well, that could be considered classical media, but a shirt is media. A couch is media. You name it. A fork is media. Everything is media for McLuhan. Every object is media, and this can be hard to get your head around, but it's it's important because it allows us to move beyond a very narrow definition of media, that it's more inclusive of what might arise in the future, and it can be more inclusive of what existed long before we had things like newspaper and so on. In other words, when we were just developing the alphabet, when we just started, with letters, namely by putting a scratch into a stick to signify that we hunted something and we killed one, all of this can be considered media. We get a really broad understanding, which is just wonderful. So it's for this reason that McLuhan decides to pick up an idea that he never credits to Freud, but I read it first in Sigmund Freud's work, in sometime before his text, Civilization and Its Discontents, sometime before The Future of an Illusion, these texts by Sigmund Freud. Media is understood as oh my God, my T key. Okay, extension. Media is understood as an extension of what? Extensions of the innate abilities of each one of us, the innate human sensibilities, just to keep it very simple, because we don't want to get too philosophical. Media are always extensions of our human abilities, like our sensory abilities, for example, such as our eyes, our ears, our mouth, what our five senses are. Maybe it goes a little bit beyond just our five senses for McLuhan, but I think that serves our purpose. So if anything is a media object, then how can we think of it as an extension? This is where it gets funky. It gets really wild here, okay, for real. Well, let's say a pen. How is it an extension of something we can do with our bodies? A pen is an extension of the finger or the fingernail. It can draw a line in the sand, but now not just in sand, but on paper, and without hurting the fingernail. Glasses are an extension of our eyes' ability to see. They allow us to see further and with more focus. So is the telescope, so are binoculars, so are contact lenses. A microphone is an extension of the voice. Now you can hear further with more clarity. You can hear me from all the way over there, and I'm not even using a megaphone, which would also be an extension of the voice, or a tin can attached to string, which is what I used to do when I was a kid. I had a long tin can go into my neighbor's house, and we thought we could hear each other. It was all make believe, I'm sure, but that's an extension of the voice. A shovel is an extension of the hand. We can dig more without damaging ourselves, deeper. These are actual examples from McLuhan. I'm not making them all up. Some of these are real examples from McLuhan. The fork is an extension of the fingers. The cup is an extension of the hand. We can hold liquid without it leaking for longer. We can even hold fish. The fishbowl, which is an extension of the hand's cupping. Some of you are thinking, this is crazy, this is absurd. But there's something to it. What else? Let's see, let's go a little further. The shoes are an extension of the foot. It allows us to jump higher. And if you have some of these basketball shoes, you know what I'm talking about. A car is an extension of the feet. We can run further and faster without getting tired. An airplane is an extension of the balls of the feet. We can jump higher and over oceans now. These are real examples from McLuhan, okay? And you can try and imagine all kinds of other examples, because there's really the real difficulty is to find something that doesn't fit this. Like McLuhan even talked about how time is an extension, like clocks. I'm not going to get into it. Computers, nervous system, memory, and on and on and on. Everything's an extension, which means we live in an anthropocentric world, a very narcissistic world in a sense. Okay, so we have all these media objects as extensions of man, of humanity. Let's move a little bit further. And we're going to get to more stricter media analysis in a moment. But the next point I'd like to make having to do with McLuhan is to talk about media objects. Oh, how would I put this? As gravity. Okay, this is my idea, but it's obviously it's already in McLuhan. He just doesn't describe it in the way that I'm giving it to you. I'm simplifying it, but he's basically saying this. Okay, we talked about gravity last week, and it wasn't it wasn't without reason. So this is what I was leading to. Media objects have gravity, and they have different gravity. How does gravity work? I reminded you last week that gravity, if something has mass, it can pull our social relationships in space and time in the same way that an object in space can produce orbits or pull things, warp, curve space-time, to put it really naively and simply. It does the same sociologically. Media objects do the same thing sociologically. The telephone has a lot of mass, unlike the cell phone, which is quite lightweight. The cell phone, because it has a lot of mass, it pulls us, or sorry, the rotary phone, it pulls us to it. The example that McLuhan really gave of this, I think, is he gave two: the light bulb and the filing cabinet. I think the filing cabinet is the best one. The light bulb, of course, is interesting because it has mass in the sense that once you have light bulbs, you can begin to do work indoors at nighttime. Even not at night when you don't have windows. All of a sudden you can have sweatshops. You know, capitalism cannot exist without the light bulb, at least not in its contemporary form, or something like a light bulb. But the filing cabinet's much more interesting because I think its contemporary equivalent would be the cloud. Let's say the iCloud, although we have all kinds of different cloud archives. The traditional filing cabinet had gravity in the sense that it was a big object. Sometimes you had stacks of them, but they existed downtown at the office space. So it had files. To do your work, you needed to go down to the filing cabinet, which was downtown, and you needed to be around the filing cabinet to access the files. So you needed to stay there, say 9 to 5 to do your work, and then you'd come home. You needed to go to the filing cabinet. It had gravity in that way, and it would bring all kinds of people downtown. Today, of course, the filing cabinet is digital, which is why it's so easy. Well, it's a relative term, but basically much easier than it used to be to work from home. You know, I'm answering emails at 3 in the morning. I'm recording this lecture at 9 p.m. I could be doing it from any room in the house. I could be in my car at a stoplight. God forbid I shouldn't. I'm just saying I could, and I could be responding to a work email or something like that. Because the filing cabinet comes with me. There's no mass to it, so I'm not pulled into a social relationship. Quite the opposite. In the electronic age, in the age of the global village, when everything's gone lightweight to such an extent that we have virtual currency itself, Bitcoin and so on, we suffer horrifically in terms of our social bond. There's nothing pulling us together. We're all exchanging things, but we feel so lonely. Loneliness and depression and solitude are among the most frequent complaints that are heard in the psychological clinics. So this is what's happening when media objects become lightweight. Okay, now I'd like to move to something maybe that you'll identify with a lot more, and it's the idea of hot and cold media. I'm going to put it like this. Hot, well, you know what? I'm going to be really clever about this and say hot media and cold media. Okay, so we have a distinction of sorts. I like to think of this as a continuum. So it's not you just have hot or you have cold. It could be, you know, it could be a bit of a continuum. And hot and cold media is really interesting for a number of reasons. I lost my sketches, my notes beside me. But you know, I've been offering you a lot of contrast here: the radio versus television, the filing cabinet versus the iCloud, the rotary phone versus the cell phone, and so on. And in doing that, you wouldn't have known this, but I'm showing you already the distinction between what McLuhan calls hot and cold media. And the difference is, apologies, my notes have crashed. I think I'm going to have to work without notes, but that's okay. That's the time. Things are not necessarily prepared in advance in the electronic age, or at least they ought not to be, without regressing to the age of radio. Hot media and cold media. What's the difference? Well, McLuhan says that hot media is more what he calls, oh, I better be read, more high definition and low participation, or if you like, low involvement. High definition, low, those are the basic ingredients for hot media, which would imply that cold media is quite the opposite, right? We have low definition and high participation or involvement. Definition and involvement, what does it mean? Let me give you some examples. Okay, so we have different media objects that have different types of gravity that pull us in different ways. I told you how the filing cabinet pulls us to the office downtown, and how the iCloud doesn't seem to pull us. We can kind of be anywhere, you know? So in that sense, the filing cabinet is more cold. I'm going to try and give you a more intuitive example of this. Think of radio again. Where would we place radio? Would it be hotter or would it be colder? Radio is most likely hotter. And the reason it's hotter is because the audience does not participate or involve themselves very much in it. Yes, you're listening, but that's a passive form of involvement. You're not offering anything back to radio. They try and trick you into cool radio down a little bit by having call-in radio shows, you know, where you can participate, but usually only a couple people can call and only a certain time. It's really still low involvement. They're fooling themselves. It's a hot medium that they're trying to cool down a little bit in a cool climate, but it's ultimately a hot medium. You're not involved in radio. It involves you. It's high definition because everything's defined in advance, like a classroom with slides, or with a lecture already prepared, or with a professor who's reading off of notes and saying everything precisely and concisely, word perfect sort of thing, where you have so much clarity in everything. That's hot. That's a hot lecture, which is why the lecture is hot. It's a hot form of media, the lecture. By contrast, let's say, social media like Facebook, Twitter. It's hard to type without letters working on your keyboard. Rest assured, my new keyboard or my new laptop should be here next week, so I won't have this problem. Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, and so on. Well, it's low definition because they don't give you anything in advance. They give you a platform, but they're not really telling you what to say. Like, the content is not spoon-fed to you. Hot media spoon feeds its information, its content, its data to you. Cold media is low definition. It asks you to participate precisely to define its content. Look, you do all the work of enjoyment for Facebook, for Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, you name it, and they get all the money, right? That's cold media. Cold media forces you to be very involved in it. And they don't give you anything except for the environment within which you participate. So that it's low definition in that sense. So if a lecture hall, the traditional classical form of university education, which for some reason most people still demand and most people still involve themselves in, That's the lecture hall. That's high definition. That's low participation. You sit, you passively listen to your professor profess his knowledge, his or her, their knowledge. You know, today, more often, what's consistent with the time is to be colder in the classroom, to have a cold classroom. You know, in other words, you don't have a lecture, you have a seminar. The seminar is cool. You know, your professor gets paid $100,000. He sits there and he says, what do you think? You know, tell me what you think. You bring all your readings and your knowledge, and you feel like you've gained something from that, and perhaps you do. That's the difference. You know, the seminar is cool, the lecture hall's hot. I hope you can try and think of maybe a few of your own examples here. Television is a cooler form of media. Let's say if, I don't know, if the book, like the typical sort of book, is hot in the sense that it tells you the whole story, then I don't know if you've seen these before, but when I was a kid, we had choose your own adventure novels. I'm just thinking of this spontaneously. Choose your own adventure novels, where, you know, at the bottom of every few pages, it'll say, if you want to do this, go to this page. They tried to cool down the hot medium of the book. And it is a little cooler, which is why I put it over here, but it's still within a hot medium. Television is cooler than radio. You know, we might situate it somewhere over here. It's cooler than radio. I'm not sure how cold of a media it is. I think it's quite cold, but not as cold as social media. Television is cold in film because, you know, what's interesting about it is you can have silences, and often on television, you know, there's a lot of editing. They cut things out. So I'll give you an example. Like when I watch, there's a scene in Vertigo, which is a great movie by Hitchcock, where, and it happened a lot in Hollywood at this time, you know, a guy would meet a woman, it's very heterosexual. Guy would meet a woman, she'd say, you want to come up for coffee? He'd go up for coffee, and then the screen would fade, and then it would unfade, and they'd be lying in bed smoking a cigarette. Okay, there's some editing work there. If this were a hot medium, you would say, okay, so he went up for coffee and then he smoked a cigarette. But it's not a hot medium, it's cold. You know that in the time where that edit was made between going up for coffee and smoking the cigarette, what they cut out, you have to guess. And what you're guessing is they had intercourse, they had sex. And there's a lot of that in film. I don't know how many of you watch some of these shows like Dexter or Lost was a great one, where you're always like, there's a whole audience of people on the internet that are trying to guess what's really going on and what this character really means. That's because you're involved in the show, right? So it's colder. Okay, so this stuff is on hot and cold media. I encourage you to try and think of other examples in your own life, and whether it's hot, like what's an automobile? Is that hot or is that cold? Where would you place it? Now, just because something's really cold, it can be freezing cold. Very, very, very low definition, very high participation. That doesn't mean that it's not still a part of our environment and determining our perceptions and our awareness. This is an important point, because it can seem in the electronic age like there is nothing determining us. But we're still determined by these media objects. Let me give you an example that occurred to me not long ago, a very controversial idea, but I'm going to roll with it just to provoke you a little bit. Think of the American election, sorry, not the election, but the presidential debates between, it was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. Everybody knew at this time, before Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, that Donald Trump was all about social media. I mean, he would write the most ridiculous stuff and then he would delete it and so on. And if this were, you know, quite a few years ago, I would bring up their Twitter feeds, Hillary Clinton's and Donald Trump's, and I would put them side by side to show you and ask you, what's the difference? Well, Donald Trump, he writes all kinds of stuff. He uses acronyms. He writes all capitals sometimes. And Hillary Clinton would write tweets, and it would be like part 1, part 2, part 3. It would be like a report. It would be very linear, and she would have a point. Okay, well, what does that mean from a McLuhan sort of perspective of trying to understand the media? It means that Clinton was practicing politics as if it were the age of radio. Forget about whether or not you agree with her. She was talking facts. Facts mattered in the age of radio. But in the age of social media, you're bombarded with all kinds of points of view, which is why McLuhan said, this is an important quote from McLuhan, you cannot have a point of view in the electronic age. You could have a point of view in the age of, let's say, radio, but in the more contemporary electronic age, especially in the age of social media, you don't have a point of view. You're bombarded with all kinds of ideas all at once. It's hard to have a sense of something fixed, like even an identity. Not for nothing that queer theory emerged, for example, at the time in the electronic age, and not before. Queer theory as a thinking of the queer. So Clinton demonstrated that she had a point of view. She had a consistent narrative. It was fact-based, and it was linear, unidirectional. Trump, on the other hand, would, well, it's quite the opposite, right? He didn't have a consistent point of view. He changed his mind, sometimes within the same sentence. I'm not attacking him. This is truth. Just look at, for example, his explanation about firing James Comey, the FBI director. Was he was already, wait, first he said, I didn't fire him. Then he said he was already fired before I fired him. And then he said, I didn't fire him, he quit, or something like that. I can't remember but the point is he gave inconsistent testimony, and he did this a lot, both on Twitter and when he spoke. But, at the level of, forget about what they're saying. I'm provoking you, okay? This is meant only as a provocation. Forget about what they're saying and whether you agree with it or not. Which one is more consistent with the electronic age? It's clearly Trump. And this is perhaps a problem, perhaps not. I'm not trying to adopt a normative position here. I'm simply trying to outline what's happening here at the level of the election as a media event. Clinton practiced politics as radio. Trump practiced politics as social media. Formally, forget about what they said. It's about how they engaged. So this is something that McLuhan is endlessly trying to drill into us. Before we had the printing press, long time before, we had a culture of more of an oral culture, a culture of orality, which we would distinguish from a later culture if we were drawing this, if some of you are taking notes, if we were plotting this sort of historical way, we'd say there's sort of something like an oral culture versus a literate, what he called a literate culture, or a textual culture, if you like. What's the difference? In an oral culture, everything happens at once. It's simultaneous. Because the ears have to do with orality. You're hearing things, and the ears are the only one of our senses that we can't easily close off. You can close your eyes, you can close your mouth, you can not touch things. You have to lift up and plug your ears, and you can see that you're plugging ears often. So when you hear sounds, you hear them all around you. It's spherical, McLuhan says. You hear it all sounds come at you at once. So more oral-based cultures, of which McLuhan mentioned, for example, like India. I spent 2 years living in India, and I'm going to be giving a series of lectures in India this summer. So I'm very familiar with India, which is very much a sound culture. And you can see its consequences for the social bond. What is its consequences? I'm going to wind down now, okay? I promise. Its consequence is that when I would go, I'm giving you an anecdotal example. When I would go to any shop in India, you don't form a line. Everybody goes around, and this happened also in some areas of the Middle East where I was in the past. You go around the cash register or whoever you need something from, lawyer, whoever it is, and you're kind of all shouting at once. And it's to a Westerner, to put it fairly naively, because this is how McLuhan put it. He did say Westerner. It would seem like chaos, like a cacophony. There's something to it, though. You know, what's interesting is if you observe what's happening, the person, let's say at the cash register, is taking some information here, and then going over here, and then over here, and then going back over here, satisfying all of it kind of at once as it occurs. And it works. It really works. Everybody, like I went to McDonald's once in India, and I thought it was rude at first, and then I realized what's happening. Everybody gets their stuff. It's almost more egalitarian in a sense too. So this is how it works. It's simultaneous culture. In a literate culture where your society is structured around literacy, reading a book, how do you read a book? It's linear, it's sequential. You move from page 1 through to page 2, and you can't go up to page 137 without passing through page 19 and 43. And so you go from point A to point B, and you pass through in sequence, one by one by one. That's literacy, a literate culture in the media studies sense of literate culture. It's not to say that people don't read in India. That's not what Marshall McLuhan is saying. So what happens in our lineups then here? If you go to a shop, let's say McDonald's, you go to the cash register, they take you one at a time. First you, and then another. You don't butt, and you don't go in front of the line. You must follow the sequence as if you're reading a book. This is how the media environment structures our sensibilities and our ways of relating to one another, right? Well, this brings me finally to the final point that I think I'll make for today, although there's so much more to say. The final point is simply that it seems to me and to McLuhan that in the most recent turn of history, we're in a new type of oral culture. There's a new type of simultaneousness to the way we interact with one another. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed, as I've been talking to you, you may have been hearing my son. I'm also parenting at the exact same time that I'm talking to you. I'm also getting a ton of important emails from work and stuff like that. And on and on and on. And some of you are probably, while you're watching this lecture, you're responding to people on Facebook and Twitter, and maybe your mom called or something, and you're talking on the phone. We have this simultaneous stuff again, and it's happening again. So that's what happens with the cooling of the media. And oral culture can be quite cool in that respect. I think I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more I'd like to say, but I'll see if I can formulate some more thoughts about this for the next time. Be well, everybody.